Yes, thank you very much. What I will try and do is maybe gather some thoughts from these fascinating series of papers, and maybe ask a couple of questions that I think a lot of these papers, a lot of these thoughts converge on a couple of questions, but also have been tasked with answering one question from the audience, so I might begin with that. So there was a question early on, I'll just read it from the comments. If utopia is an ideal social condition, it means that it should be proposed by human beings who also need to be ideal. The notion of the ideal man versus the non-ideal one has strong nationalistic and racist connotations. Isn't this a big contradiction for the interpretation of utopia? Now, this kind of question touches a little bit upon what Andreas Takis was also talking about, with the worry about the fall into totalitarian thinking. But I think it's a key question in this sense, because the answer now brings us onto the terrain of utopia, depends on whether one starts with a negative or a positive gesture. So if one begins with a positive gesture, that is of saying, here is the blueprint for utopia, here is what the ideal society needs to be, one is close to totalitarian thinking and the danger that's identified by the question. But if one begins with a negative gesture, there is something far more interesting in the theorization of utopia in this. Now, go back to Marx. Marx never gave a blueprint of the communist society, so his wasn't the positive nature. Okay, we've talked a lot about Lenin today, not so much about Marx. Lenin's is clearly a positive gesture, but Marx's is not a blueprint. Marx says if there is a release from the topos, if we can break from a certain way of thinking about human association, if we can break from a condition that is catastrophic of human association, then perhaps we can release human potential and human association and human society. That is a moment not of prescription, but of release. It is not a positive, but a negative gesture, because the topos is catastrophic. Marx calls it commodification. It's the idea that social interchange is ab initio caught up in the commodity form and severely undercut. So utopia here is a move against that topos, a topos that grounds human association into the condition of commodity, of the logic of the commodity. Now, in a sense, and I finished this first point, I have one second point. In a sense, and perhaps connecting to Marco's plea to look at the connection between utopia and contradiction, there is perhaps a contradiction in utopia in the way in which the negative and the positive interface, because on the one hand, and this is, I refer back to Andreas Takis' point, on the one hand, we have a universal brotherhood, and that seems to be totalitarian or lead, and Derrida also talks about every time one speaks of the presence of the people, it immediately shades into totalitarianism. And yet at the same time, what would it mean to have an aspiration of brotherhood and of solidarity that isn't universal? So we're caught up in a bit of a contradictory problem here, problem of contradiction. And I agree very much with Andreas's argument about the formative enactments and a we that respect certain procedural requirements, even if they're Rawlsian, but one that's, we're not stuck in the contradiction, we can work with it, but we shouldn't shy away from the fact that utopia presents us with both sides of a social dynamic that is problematic, that is perhaps even dangerous. Yeah? But let me pick up a couple of points. This is my second point. I think we do have a little bit of time. I won't take more than 5 minutes. Okay. I just wanted to connect a few things, and going back to the idea again of utopia, of this negation of topos, the negative moment, the negation of ground. Okay, look how interesting it is that utopia is defined, in a moment of negativity. It is that which defies locution. It is not the suggestion of a different locution. Initially, utopian thought is that which departs from a certain way of understanding the world. It departs to move away from, let's say, a given economy of representation. And I say this in order to capture so much of the wealth of today's presentations, which were all about the economies of representation and trying to challenge ways in which those economies operated, whether it had to do with the disrespect of given boundaries, with Tatlin, a refusal to respect boundaries, whether with Alberti earlier, it is about the unclassifiable genre. Again, the utopian linked with the refusal to accept the given. Utopia linked, if you like, with what breaks with a certain order or a certain economy of understanding and representation. And I want to finish with this really interesting thought of how this negative gesture can actually happen, what might allow it passage. And again, I'm always intrigued by the idea of the dialectic, the idea that something that is born out of what exists, in Arvatov's words, the bosom of the old order, something that comes from it, because of course, that is where things are generated in existing situation. What is born out of what is, under what conditions, and yet can transcend that condition, which is a moment of utopia. And these are not smooth transitions. These are not smooth passages. And Dr. Alifragis did extremely well to alert us to this idea of the epoche and that which is suspended. And I finish with this idea of a suspension of the established lineages, a defamiliarization, the idea of epoche, the idea of that which is suspended. He didn't mention this, but Husserl, since he was talking about phenomenology, has this notion of the strange. And the notion of the strange in Husserl is precisely that which defamiliarizes, that which invites, that which disturbs, if you like, the smooth passage in the emergence of the phenomenon. And what's so interesting about Tarkovsky and Stalker, and thank you very much for those extraordinary pictures of the zone and the blurring of the boundaries, the zone as a space of the succession of spaces. Everything equivocates here. This is the realm of pure ambivalence. And there's something beautiful about the unsettledness that captures something, I think, about the utopian vein. This idea of something that departs from the ways in which things are processed. Things are processed down particular path dependencies and the potential that is generated by refusing to follow those paths. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.